There's a moment in every man's life when he sits in a room that no longer feels like his own, listening to someone he once loved tear open old wounds as if they never healed. And the part that stings the most isn't the accusation, it's the familiarity. You've lived this scene before, the raised voice, the shifting story, the emotional storm that arrives right when you're about to speak your truth. Here's the part nobody ever tells you. Every time you stay silent to keep the peace, a piece of you quietly dies. You don't notice it at first. You convince yourself you're being patient, understanding, strong. But patience becomes self-betrayal, understanding becomes erasure, and strength becomes the cage you lock yourself in. And while you're drowning in restraint, she's rewriting the narrative in real time. You become the villain in a story you didn't write. But the real betrayal isn't her explosion. It's the way you keep absorbing it, hoping that one day it will stop. Try something the next time conflict hits. Pause, breathe, and ask yourself a simple question. What are we actually arguing about right now? Watch how quickly the ground shifts under your feet. It begins with something trivial. Dishes, schedules, a missed message. Then it mutates. Suddenly it's about what you said last month, the tone you used last week, the thing she claims you meant 3 years ago. You're no longer dealing with one issue. You're trapped in a maze where every turn opens another door to another accusation. And the deeper you step into the labyrinth, the more you feel reality slipping. But here's the uncomfortable truth. She's not trying to solve the conflict. She's trying to win the frame. When emotions become a weapon, logic becomes irrelevant. You start apologizing for things you didn't do just to make the onslaught stop. And while you're losing yourself in that fog, she gains something far more valuable than an apology. Control over the narrative of who you are. You've been taught your whole life to interpret emotional chaos as vulnerability. You tell yourself she's overwhelmed, stressed, wounded, or simply too emotional. That interpretation keeps you captive, because if you assume her storm is accidental, you'll keep rushing into it like a firefighter desperate to keep the house from burning. But step back, really step back, and observe the timing. Notice how the tears fall exactly when you're closing in on a point she can't dismiss. Notice how anger erupts precisely when accountability enters the room. Notice how confusion floods the space the moment you ask for clarity. Patterns don't lie. They reveal what words hide. And when a pattern repeats long enough, it stops being chaos and becomes strategy. That's the moment your worldview cracks, not because she changed, but because you finally saw her behaviour without the filter society forced onto you. I once worked with a man who tried for 2 years to have a simple conversation about finances with his girlfriend. Every time he brought it up, she collapsed into tears. Not just soft crying, full emotional collapse. Show her a bank statement. Tears. Ask about her spending. Tears. Mention the credit card balance. A complete breakdown. For 2 years, he interpreted those tears as fragility. He comforted her, reassured her, rubbed her back while apologizing for bringing stress into the relationship. And while he was apologizing, she slowly buried them in more than $30,000 of debt. Not because she didn't understand, because confusion protected her from accountability. Weaponized emotion always hides inside what looks like weakness. And men fall for it because they've been conditioned to treat female emotion as truth rather than tactic. But the moment you recognize the pattern, something irreversible happens. You stop confusing tears with honesty, and you start seeing them as the smokescreen they are. A man I worked with once recorded an argument with his partner, perfectly legal where he lived, because he couldn't understand why every discussion left him confused and guilty. When we played it back, the truth hit him like a blade. In just 20 minutes, she shifted topics 14 times. 14. Each shift happened the moment he was close to making a coherent point. Every time he tried to address one issue, she opened a new front. He was fighting a hydra. Cut off one head, two more appeared. This wasn't miscommunication. It was misdirection. By the end, he was apologizing repeatedly, begging her to calm down, desperate for resolution. And neither of us, listening to that recording, could identify what he was apologizing for. That's the trap. When the argument becomes infinite, your exhaustion becomes her leverage. When the ground never stops moving, you stop trying to stand, and that's when she wins, not by proving she's right, but by breaking your will to resist. What most men never notice is that beneath the chaos lie unspoken rules that govern the entire dynamic. They're never stated, never negotiated, but the moment you break one, you're punished as if you signed a contract in your sleep. The first rule is the myth of mind reading. You're expected to know what she wants without her saying it, sense her needs without context, predict her emotional shifts without clues. And when you fail, as every human inevitably does, it's not treated as a misunderstanding. It's treated as proof that you don't care. Imagine a job where your boss gives you no instructions, then fires you for failing invisible tasks. In every other area of life, we call that insanity. In relationships, it's sold as intimacy. If you loved me, you'd just know. But love isn't clairvoyance, and intimacy isn't divination. It's communication. Yet communication is precisely the thing that threatens the control dynamic, so it gets replaced with expectation and punishment. The second unspoken rule is even more destructive: emotional supremacy. Her feelings aren't treated as her perspective, they're treated as the ultimate truth. If she feels disrespected, that means you disrespected her, regardless of your intent. If she feels unloved, that means you don't love her, no matter what your actions show. Reality becomes something she edits, not something either of you lives in. I once counseled a man whose wife accused him of cheating simply because she felt it. No suspicious messages, no strange absences, no evidence, just intuition. And instead of challenging the absurdity, he was forced into a position where he had to prove a negative, prove the absence of something that never existed. How do you disprove a feeling? You don't. That's why it's the perfect weapon. It's unfalsifiable. It turns her internal weather into your moral trial. And once that dynamic takes hold, you're no longer a partner, you're a defendant. The third rule is the emotional double standard, one of the most corrosive forces in modern relationships. She can shout, throw objects, unleash insults meant to cut you to the bone, and it's all chalked up to expression, stress, hormones, just having a moment. But you? Raise your voice once and suddenly you're dangerous. She can break down monthly and it's understandable. You break down once and you're weak, unstable, in need of therapy. One client was having dinner when his wife snapped and hurled a plate across the room. When he yelled, "Stop!" she called the police, claiming she felt unsafe. He was removed from his own home. That wasn't an anomaly. That was the system functioning exactly as designed. Culture reinforces her victimhood, not your humanity. Movies, series, articles, online communities all frame her emotions as sacred and yours as suspect. And when you live long enough in a world that devalues your emotional reality, you begin to doubt it yourself. That's the most dangerous part, when you start believing you deserve the blame you've been trained to carry. What happens to a man trapped in this emotional labyrinth isn't sudden, it's slow erosion. You begin adjusting your tone, then your words, then your needs, then your entire personality to avoid triggering another spiral. At first, it feels like love, like compromise, empathy, maturity. But over time, those adjustments become amputations. You cut off pieces of yourself to keep the peace. And one day, without noticing when it happened, you're no longer speaking honestly, reacting authentically, or even thinking freely. You're not a partner anymore. You're a hostage negotiating with the person holding the rope, and the more you shrink, the louder she becomes, because silence is oxygen for emotional domination. The less you resist, the more space she has to expand. That's why so many men feel like they're disappearing in their own homes, because they are. Not physically, but psychologically, spiritually, internally. Your identity becomes collateral damage in a war you never agreed to fight. Some men reach a breaking point when they finally see the pattern as a pattern. It's the day you stop interpreting every emotional storm as coincidence and start recognizing it as timing. The day you notice the tears always fall when accountability enters the room. The day you realize anger erupts right when you're making a valid point she can't dismiss. The day confusion arrives precisely when you ask a direct question. Once you see the choreography, you can't go back to pretending it's chaos. And that's when the awakening begins. Not because she changed, but because your perception finally aligned with reality. You stop romanticizing emotional volatility as passion, and you start seeing it as power disguised as fragility. It's like turning on the lights in a room you've been stumbling through in the dark. Everything was always there. You just weren't allowed to see it clearly. I once worked with a man whose girlfriend turned every financial discussion into an emotional ambush. The moment he mentioned a budget, she cried. If he asked about spending, she cried harder. If he mentioned debt, she broke down completely. He spent 2 years believing he was hurting her by bringing up money, so he comforted her, reassured her, apologized for causing stress. Meanwhile, she quietly accumulated more than $30,000 in debt. She wasn't confused. She wasn't fragile. She was offloading accountability by using emotion as a smokescreen. Weaponized emotion doesn't look like aggression. It looks like collapse. And because men are conditioned from birth to protect, not confront, they fall for the illusion every time. He thought he was helping her regulate her feelings. In reality, he was being trained to abandon his own. And once a man internalizes that training, he becomes easy to control. What makes this dynamic so dangerous is that it doesn't start violently. It starts subtly. A few tears during a disagreement, a sudden accusation during a quiet moment, a shift in tone when she senses she's losing ground. You brush it off, telling yourself she's just emotional. Everyone gets overwhelmed. But over months and years, those small moments accumulate. They become the rhythm of the relationship. And as the pattern strengthens, your resistance weakens. You stop fighting not because you agree, but because it's too exhausting to continue. That's how emotional conditioning works. Repetition replaces reason. The more you concede to avoid conflict, the more you teach her that emotional escalation works. And the more it works, the more she uses it. Before you realize what's happening, you're living inside a script you didn't write, performing roles you didn't choose, stuck in cycles she controls. And the cruelest part, you blame yourself for the cage you were manipulated into accepting. The cultural reinforcement behind all of this is so subtle and pervasive that most men don't even notice it shaping them. From childhood, you were taught that women's emotions are sacred, while yours are dangerous. Her tears are authenticity, yours are manipulation. Her anger is empowerment, yours is abuse. Every movie, every series, every social trend pushes the same narrative until you internalize it without realizing. So when conflict arises, you instinctively assume she's the victim, even when she's the one detonating the emotional explosives. This programming doesn't just disarm you, it rewrites your instincts. Instead of standing your ground, you self-censor. Instead of expressing yourself, you shrink. Instead of addressing wrongdoing, you apologize for existing. And the more you bend, the more the world applauds her courage and condemns your insensitivity. Culture teaches women that their feelings are truth, and teaches men that theirs are threats. and that asymmetry becomes the invisible architecture inside which your relationship collapses. I see the effects of this imbalance every day. Men who are once confident leaders at work become hesitant shadows at home. Men who make decisive calls in high-pressure environments suddenly second-guess every word they speak to their partners. The contrast is startling. They're powerful in the world and powerless in their living rooms, because outside truth matters, evidence matters, clarity matters. Inside, everything gets filtered through the lens of her emotional reality. You can win in every arena of life and still lose the war in your own home. And the tragic part is that most men never realize it's happening until they're already broken down. They think they're failing her. They think they're somehow not enough. They don't understand that they're trapped in a system where the rules are rigged from the moment they engage. It's not a lack of effort. It's the impossibility of a game designed for them to lose. When you question her emotions, you're insensitive. When you validate them, you're admitting guilt. When you search for middle ground, you're manipulative. Every path leads to punishment, not resolution. And over time, you stop trying to find the truth and instead try to find whatever response creates the least explosion. That's how men become emotional caretakers instead of equal partners. You're no longer addressing problems, you're managing her volatility. And that burden slowly hollows you out. It destroys the part of you that once believed partnership meant mutual support. Instead, you're left scanning every conversation for emotional landmines, calculating risk, rehearsing responses, bracing for unpredictable storms. Daily life becomes a survival strategy, not a relationship. And surviving someone isn't loving them, it's enduring them. That's a truth most men only allow themselves to admit once they've already checked out internally. The saddest men I meet aren't angry, they're exhausted. They're the ones who spent years trying to fix a relationship that punished honesty and rewarded silence. They read the books, they tried therapy, they communicated more, gave more, tolerated more, sacrificed more, but nothing worked. Because nothing could work. You can't heal a dynamic that depends on your suppression to survive, and when the realization finally hits, it doesn't come with rage, it comes with resignation. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference, and that indifference arrives quietly, like a final exhale after years of holding your breath. That's the turning point for most men, the moment they stop fighting. Not because they don't care, but because caring has become synonymous with suffering. It's the moment they choose peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, self-preservation over emotional servitude. And once a man reaches that threshold, the relationship is already over. He just hasn't walked out the door yet. When men finally pull back from the emotional battlefield, something unexpected happens. Clarity. For the first time in years, they can hear their own thoughts without someone else's feelings drowning them out. And in that silence, they begin to notice the obvious. Life without constant conflict is peaceful. Life without unpredictable explosions is stable. Life without emotional caretaking is liberating. A client once told me, "I spent 10 years trying to make her happy and I was miserable. I've spent 2 years making myself happy and I feel alive." He wasn't celebrating her absence, he was celebrating his return to himself. Men don't walk away because they can't handle women. They walk away because they finally recognize they don't need the suffering they were trained to normalize. No one prepared them for the possibility that solitude, far from being punishment, might actually feel like freedom. This is the part society refuses to understand. When a man checks out, he doesn't slam the door, he drifts, not out of cruelty but out of depletion. The next argument isn't worth the energy. The next accusation isn't worth defending. The next emotional demand isn't worth meeting. He stops fighting not because he's weak, but because he's done sacrificing his sanity to maintain a peace that never existed. He doesn't leave in anger, he leaves in silence. And that silence terrifies people who relied on his compliance. Because a man who no longer reacts is a man who can no longer be controlled. Indifference becomes his shield, detachment becomes his refuge. And once a man discovers emotional neutrality, he becomes unreachable by the tactics that once held him captive. Men get shamed endlessly for walking away. You're bitter. Who hurt you? You'll die alone. These lines aren't concerns, they're weapons. They're used to pull him back into a system that benefits from his involvement. Because if men truly understood how peaceful their lives could be without emotional chaos, more would walk away. This shame narrative only works on men who still need women's approval. But once a man's validation source shifts inward, not outward, the shame evaporates. You can't guilt a man who no longer needs permission to be happy. And that shift, that psychological pivot, is what society fears most. Not men becoming isolated, but men becoming independent, emotionally, financially, spiritually. Men who choose themselves become unpredictable to a culture that relies on their sacrifice. Modern relationships have become a cost-benefit analysis, and men are finally doing the math. What do they gain? What do they lose? What do they risk? Divorce courts destroy men financially. False accusations destroy reputations. Emotional volatility destroys mental health. And the rewards? Conditional affection, constant criticism, unbalanced responsibility, minimal reciprocity. The traditional benefits, family, legacy, partnership, have eroded, while traditional obligations remain intact. It's a lopsided contract and men are expected to sign it blindly. But younger men are watching what happened to their fathers, brothers, co-workers, mentors, and they're opting out. Not because they're incapable of commitment, but because the modern deal is simply not worth the risk. Men aren't avoiding women, they're avoiding destruction. When survival instincts activate, logic takes over, and logic says, don't play a game where the house always wins. Walk away from the table, choose a different life, build on your own terms. And that choice, quiet, rational, unmistakably sane, is shaping an entire generation. One of the most powerful tactics in emotional dynamics is reframing. Watch closely and you'll see it. She shifts the focus from what happened to how she felt about what happened. You ask a logical question. She responds with an accusation about your tone. You bring up a fact. She brings up how your words made her feel attacked. It's not about the car she crashed. It's about how your concern made her feel judged. Suddenly you're apologizing for her mistakes, soothing her while ignoring the wreckage in your own life. When someone can rewrite history with emotion, the truth becomes irrelevant. I watched a friend crumble under this tactic. His girlfriend totaled his car. When he asked about insurance, she collapsed into tears, insisting he was being cruel. In minutes, the conversation shifted from accountability to him comforting the person who ruined his property. She never filed the claim. He paid for everything, and as he handed over the money, he genuinely believed he'd made her feel bad. That's what emotional supremacy does. It makes you doubt your right to reality. But rewriting the present isn't enough. Some women learn to rewrite the past. They retroactively redefine memories based on how they feel today. That vacation you both loved. Now she realizes it was terrible because she felt stressed. That thoughtful gift, suddenly insensitive because she now interprets it differently. Entire years get repainted through the lens of a current emotion. I've seen women stand in court and label a decade-long marriage as abusive, because in hindsight, they felt neglected during periods when their husbands were simply working extra hours. Emotion becomes a time machine that corrupts the truth, and the system listens, not to evidence, but to feelings packaged as revelation. When memory is fluid and emotion is law, a man's entire history becomes vulnerable to reinterpretation, and the more she rewrites, the more he questions his own sanity. This doesn't start with grand accusations, it starts with small tests. She pushes a tiny boundary, blames you for something trivial. If you accept it, the next test grows. A slightly bigger accusation, a slightly harsher reaction, a slightly deeper emotional collapse. You think you're being understanding. She thinks she's calibrating what she can get away with. Emotional conditioning works like boiling water, slow and subtle until it's too late to escape. Men confuse peacekeeping with love, not realizing they're being shaped into emotional servants. First, you apologize for things you know aren't your fault. Then you apologize for things that never happened. Then you apologize for her feelings. Eventually, your entire emotional world revolves around preventing her next meltdown. And once you reach that stage, your identity is no longer yours. It's a negotiation you lose daily. As the years pass, the double standards tighten like a noose. Early in the relationship, she may occasionally acknowledge your emotions, but as the dynamic deepens, your feelings slowly become inconveniences, distractions, threats to her control. Her bad day demands full emotional support. Your bad day is you being negative. Her stress requires empathy. Your stress is a failure to handle your responsibilities. You start swallowing your pain because expressing it only leads to more conflict. And nothing corrodes a man faster than the belief that his emotions are worthless. I've watched men who endure combat-level pressure at work crumble in front of a partner who dismisses their humanity with a single sentence. You're overreacting. It's not the dismissal that destroys them, it's the repetition. Because repetition becomes identity. If someone tells you long enough that your feelings don't matter, eventually you accept it. And once you accept it, you stop being a partner. You become a utility, useful only when you're silent. The strangest thing happens when a man steps outside the emotional storm long enough to breathe. He realizes he no longer needs the very thing he was conditioned to chase. For years, he believed relationships were the source of meaning, stability, fulfillment. But without the daily chaos, he discovers something unsettling. He feels better, more rested, more focused, more himself. It's not that he hates women. It's that the version of relationships being offered drains him dry. A client once said, "I thought I needed a partner to feel whole. Turns out I only needed space to hear myself." And that's the revelation most men never see coming. It isn't loneliness they feared. It was the withdrawal from the emotional addiction they mistook for love. Once that addiction breaks, clarity replaces confusion, peace replaces tension, and the silence that once terrified them becomes a sanctuary they're unwilling to give up. You can always tell when a man has crossed this threshold. His face changes, not hardened, just calm. His reactions soften, not out of resignation, but out of understanding. He stops arguing, not because he's defeated, but because the battle no longer concerns him. Emotional warfare only works on someone who still cares about the outcome. A man who reaches clarity stops responding to provocation the way he used to. You can't manipulate someone who has nothing left to protect. He's not chasing validation. He's not avoiding conflict. He's simply done sacrificing himself to maintain a connection that harms him more than it heals. And when a man becomes unreachable in that way, the power dynamic collapses instantly. She can scream, cry, provoke, but he's already somewhere she can't touch. This shift terrifies the modern relationship structure because it exposes a truth society desperately avoids. Men don't need to participate for the system to keep running. If they choose solitude, hobbies, friendships, health, purpose, nothing collapses in their personal lives. In fact, many of them thrive. They get fit, they earn more, they sleep better, they rediscover passions they abandoned long ago. And as they rise, society tries to pull them back with insults disguised as insights. You're bitter. You're scared of commitment. You'll die alone. These aren't predictions, they're pressure tactics, designed to scare men back into roles that benefit everyone except them. But fear only works on men who haven't tasted freedom. Once they have, the spell breaks, and the guilt that once caged them loses its power. This is why an entire generation of men is opting out, not from bitterness, not from weakness, but from rationality. They're doing what no generation before them had permission to do: analyze the cost, evaluate the risk, weigh the return. Divorce laws, false allegations, emotional labor, financial exposure. They see it all clearly, and clarity breeds caution. They're not avoiding relationships. They're avoiding destruction. They're not rejecting love. They're rejecting contracts written in invisible ink that only reveal their terms when it's too late to escape. And this terrifies a system built on male sacrifice. Because when men stop participating blindly, the entire dynamic shifts. Women ask where the good men have gone without asking what pushed them away. Society blames the men for disengaging instead of questioning the environments that made disengagement logical. But logic wins. It always does. And logic is leading men, quietly, consistently, away from anything that demands their suffering as proof of their devotion. The collapse of the traditional relationship isn't happening because men suddenly became weak, confused, or immature. It's happening because they finally started paying attention. They stopped accepting emotional chaos as normal. They stopped believing sacrifice was the price of love. They stopped letting guilt dictate their choices. This clarity scares society because it removes the primary tool used to control men: shame. Shame for leaving. Shame for refusing, shame for choosing peace over conflict. But shame only works on men who still believe they owe the world their suffering. Once they break that belief, they step into a new identity, one built on autonomy, self-respect, and refusal to participate in self-destruction. Women panic because the old emotional levers no longer work. Society panics because the old expectations no longer hold. But men finally feel something they haven't felt in years: control over their own lives. This shift has massive implications. Birth rates are collapsing, marriages are declining, divorce filings are increasingly one-sided. Women ask where all the committed men have gone without asking why commitment became a liability. Men aren't afraid of relationships. They're afraid of what relationships have turned into. Institutions where they absorb all the risk while receiving a fraction of the reward. And the moment they realize they can build fulfilling, stable, meaningful lives without exposing themselves to that risk, they do. Walking away isn't failure. It's self-preservation. And once a man learns he can survive and thrive outside the emotional economy he was raised to serve, he never returns to it blindly. The contract is broken because the terms were never honoured, and men are responding the only rational way: by opting out. Some women recognise this shift. They see men leaving and start asking the hard questions. What value do I bring that makes commitment worthwhile? What needs to change? How do we restore balance? These women aren't the problem, they're the solution. But their voices are drowned out by those who demand more while offering less, who cling to entitlement instead of accountability. Those women won't adapt. They don't believe they should. They expect the old system to keep rewarding them even as the foundation collapses. But men are no longer obligated to participate in a structure built on asymmetric sacrifice. They're not angry, they're awake. and awakening is irreversible. Once a man sees the truth, he doesn't unsee it. Once he experiences peace, he doesn't return to chaos. Every man must learn one truth. Walking away is not weakness. Refusing to self-destruct is not fear. Choosing peace is not cowardice. You're not broken for rejecting systems that break you. You're not wrong for protecting what remains of you. The world will try to convince you otherwise, because a man who chooses himself is a man who cannot be controlled. And a man who cannot be controlled is the most dangerous kind, because he is free. The ultimate red pill isn't about exposing women, it's about exposing the conditioning that taught you your value depended on them. It's about realizing you were whole long before anyone demanded you shrink. You don't need permission to exist. You don't need validation to be worthy. You don't need chaos to feel alive. Your life is yours. Your peace is yours. Your happiness is yours. And the moment you reclaim them, you stop walking through life as a ghost and start living as a man finally awake.